All right. Welcome tonight to Pandemic Politics, from lockdown to liberation. Tonight is Racism in Medicine and History. And tonight we have a really nice panel of folks who have joined us tonight to talk about this topic, the serious topic that we have for tonight, racism in medicine and history. I'll do the framing, and I want to welcome everyone here. We have students in the Zoom room from U of M who are participating, and we have folks on YouTube. I'm Carolyn Baker. I'm with the General Baker Institute, and I'm joining Semester in Detroit to help put on this series. I want to thank Semester in Detroit for allowing us to join them and help pick out the panelists for tonight. So without further ado, racism in medicine and history. The call to declare racism a public health crisis suggests a shift towards a holistic approach that will address the roots of the problems rather than merely addressing the symptoms of inequality. Yet public health and healthcare in the US have a history of inequality, indifference, and violence toward people of color. While the responses of the COVID-19 pandemic suggest the continued impact of eugenics and white supremacy on public health and policy decisions in the US. Here in a fact sheet that I'll read, put out by the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, states, our healthcare system fails to meet the needs of millions of Americans. Care is unaffordable, inaccessible, and unequal. At the same time, as a nation, we spend more per person on healthcare than almost any other country. This money lines the pockets of healthcare profiteers and investors while leaving nearly 140 million people facing financial hardship as a direct result of their need for healthcare. It does not need to be this way. We can and we must take swift action to secure to everyone the basic human right to healthcare and a healthy environment. Growing healthcare costs means that tens of millions of people do not get the treatment they need. 87 million people are either uninsured or underinsured. During the COVID-19 pandemic, approximately 16.2 million have likely lost their employer-provided insurance, but still the government has not provided universal health care coverage. 11 million undocumented immigrants, many of whom were in essential jobs, are not eligible for public or employer-provided health care. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy. A 2019 study found that 33% of Americans reported that they or someone in their family had to put off getting medical treatment because of high costs. In 2016, 43% of adults with private health insurance struggled to afford making their deductible payments. As of 2017, the US was spending about $3.24 trillion on personal health care. This was 17% of the total US GDP. There is a deep inequality and discrimination in the healthcare system, leading to the worst care for the poor, people of color, people in rural areas, and the LGBTQ plus people. Failures of our healthcare systems around the COVID-19 crisis has made the pandemic worse in poor, Black, and minority communities. African Americans have died at a rate of 50.3 per 100,000 people, compared to 2.7 for whites, 22.9 for Latinos, and 22.7 for Asian Americans. The Navajo Nation has a higher infection rate of any state. Infant mortality rates for Black infants are twice as high as for white infants. Black women are at least 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes as non-Hispanic white women. Since 2019, 120 rural hospitals have been closed. 12 hospitals have been closed during 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Indigenous and Native Americans have a life expectancy that is 5.5 years lower than the United States average. Tonight, we will take a deeper dive into some of the things brought out in this fact sheet that I just read, done by the Poor People's Campaign. Our panelists show how racialized understandings of public health safety, pain, access to care, and treatment have led to horrific attacks against people of color. Without further ado, I will let our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into some of these inequalities that we bring up with racism in medicine. Azadeh, can you go ahead?
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of this discussion. And just so you all know, I am a graduate of the University of Michigan for all of my education. So great to be chatting with you all, and lived in Ann Arbor and Detroit area for more than 9 years. So again, great to be in conversation with you all. So my name is Azadeh Shahshahani. I serve as Legal and Advocacy Director with Project South. We are a movement building and movement support organization based in Georgia, and we work with grassroots organizations and communities, directly impacted communities in the US South. We also partner with folks in the Global South. And I'm also a past president of the National Lawyers Guild, an organization that was founded in 1937 and has always held itself out as the legal arm of the movement in terms of providing support to social justice movements here in the US as well as the Global South.
Thank you. Paula?
Good night. I'm so happy and also honored to be here in this conversation today. My name is Paula Astudillo. I am from Chile, South America. We have some indigenous languages, but also Spanish. I'm a native Spanish speaker. And I live in Detroit since about 3 years ago, Detroit, Michigan, and I'm part of the Movimiento Cosecha, which is an organization led by immigrant workers fighting for respect, dignity, and permanent protection for the 11 millions of undocumented immigrants in this country. I'm also involved with other movements around my city and also in my home country. I would say maybe I've been a popular educator for some years, also with some experience in Chile and Latin America, a feminist, a mom, a neighbor, and now here as an immigrant working with our immigrant rights, for our immigrant rights.
Thank you, Paula. Naira.
Peace, y'all. I'm Naira Sharif. I live in Flint, and I am the director of Flint Rising, which is a grassroots organization and coalition of different progressive organizations that formed in the aftermath of one of the largest public health disasters in the history of this country, the Flint water crisis. And as Azadeh, I am also, I wouldn't say a proud alumna, but I did, they did take my money and I graduated from the University of Michigan. And like, I'm actually like in my third career, my degree was in computer science. I worked as a software engineer, and then I took some classes and I worked in public health, and now I do water justice organizing.
Thank y'all. So I'm going to pass it to Azadeh so you can tell us about what happened there in Georgia and what you were able to expose and what's going on now.
Thank you so much again. So first, I would like to say that we are part of a movement that believes systemic state violence is not to be tolerated in any form, whether it is ICE caging and harming immigrants or cops murdering Black people in the street with impunity. We have documented conditions at the Irving County Detention Center for many years, and we know that the treatment of immigrants at this prison has always been horrid. In our 2017 report, In Prison Justice, Inside Two Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, Project South and the Penn State Law Center for Immigrants' Rights Clinic found evidence of sexual abuse, inadequate medical care, lack of prenatal care for pregnant women, lack of clean drinking water, and rampant use of solitary confinement at the Irving County Detention Center. In the spring, just as the pandemic was taking off in the US, a group of women at the Irving County Detention Center came together and produced a video to voice their concerns about their fears about catching COVID and the fact that the facility wasn't doing anything to protect them. So instead of addressing their concerns, the guards actually placed them in solitary confinement for several days, which posed grave emotional damage to the affected women. In September, we filed a complaint with the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, along with our partners, the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, Georgia Detention Watch, and South Georgia Support Network. And so in the complaint, we documented various issues, such as medical staff deliberately not testing detained immigrants for COVID-19, even when they're symptomatic, have pre-existing conditions, or have requested to be tested multiple times spanning a month. And the management mandating employees to work even if they're symptomatic and waiting for the test results, among other issues related to lack of protection for COVID. But also the shocking revelations about medical abuse against women's bodies, which further highlight the extent of the egregious abuses at the facility, and the fact that Black and brown immigrant women have been held in an extremely vulnerable position at this prison for many years, where they have no control over their bodies and no say over what is done to them, is sickening. We are glad that our complaint opened the door to more women coming forward with accounts of what was done to them. There were 19 cases documented by the Los Angeles Times, 57 cases documented by lawyers as reported by The Intercept, and we are co-counsel in a class action lawsuit filed in late December, and as part of the lawsuit, more than 40 women submitted sworn testimony to court about medical abuse at Irving. Not surprisingly, ICE has not been forthcoming with the information. Instead, they've been actively trying to cover their own tracks through deporting survivors and witnesses to medical abuse. And if it was not because of the documentation work happening and advocates' efforts to try to track down and reach out to women all over the world and courage of the impacted women, none of this would have ever come to light. So given what we have learned about the systematic violence against immigrants' bodies at the Irving County Detention Center, we need ICE to come clean about what is happening at facilities nationwide. Immigrants cannot have their bodily integrity at the mercy of ICE and the private prison corporations that the agency contracts with. And that is why we have filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain information about gynecological procedures at ICE facilities nationwide. We filed this in the fall. Not surprisingly, we didn't receive any information, so we had to file a lawsuit. And currently, we're negotiating with the government to try to get the information that we need so that we can release it to the public. But I should say, it pains me to know that there could be many more women out there in different parts of the world who will never be able to talk about what happened to them and the abuse that they suffered while at Irving, let alone receive a measure of redress, while living with the lifelong damage to their bodies and spirits. So the scrutiny must not stop with examining the actions of one individual. This is about ICE and the private prison corporation LaSalle. Ervin should be shut down immediately and people should be freed. And the egregious retaliation against those who speak out must end. The women who suffered medical abuse should receive redress for the harm they suffered. And the US government, as well as the private prison corporation running this facility, which is LaSalle, must be held accountable. We are determined to push ahead by pursuing a thorough congressional investigation, Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General investigation, and we have also gone to the UN and the Inter-American Commission to expose the human rights violations. And I would like to leave you with this quote: "Nobody is free until everybody is free," which is from Fannie Lou Hamer, freedom fighter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm gonna go to Paula.
Yes, can we try to share my screen? I always believe that political and social art is a very good way to, or tool for organizing and for showing. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, let me try to, I don't know how to, okay. Well, give me 1 second so I can adjust. Because I have some notes here, also because of my accent and still learning to translate Spanish thoughts to English ones. So can you see my presentation, right?
Yes.
Okay, Movimiento Cosecha, which means harvest movement. Okay, so the discrimination and racism in health and the health system is not new, right? But for our immigrant community, mostly Black and Brown, the health of immigrants in the US is continuously being attacked and denied by the capitalism, individualism, racist, and patriarchal society that we are in. As immigrants of color, we experience racism and discrimination, the absence of respect and dignity. And these are daily and permanent attacks on the individual, family, and collective health of our communities. In the US, as in many other countries though, health is not a human right. It is not guaranteed. Therefore, someone always pays for it. Your employer, yourself, the taxes via Medicaid for the more dispossessed. This applies to everyone, to the entire working class. But it's even worse without citizenship status, without papers. So we are not subjects or individuals of any kind of social system aid, including health or the access to health. So this is the first problem. The first problem is that we don't have access to health or the health care system without papers that confirm our existence, right? A social security number, a driver license ID, or other documents. Without that, we cannot access health services, and we are banned of those. We don't have health insurance options. Basically, we live in the shadows of the health system, hoping and praying and crossing the fingers to not get sick, to not need a dentist, not need or even worse, not having an emergency, right? This is happening today, but it's not something new. I want to tell you a story, like it's a very personal one. I mean, it's a case of a family friend who live in Florida, a woman who has been in this country for many years. 40 years ago, she had a very serious accident. Her life was in danger, or she died in the street, or she got an ID document to enter a hospital. She had a gift given from someone else who had that was a passport from a died US woman, but she never used it. She didn't want to use a passport that wasn't her. In that moment, when her life was in danger, her family decided to use the passport as the only way to access to the emergency room at the hospital and save her life. This was 40 years ago. Today, with more than 40 years living in Florida, and also on the way more than 25 years ago that she adjusted her status and was granted citizenship, under Trump's era, some citizenship processes were reviewed, and she is in danger of being deported because of that situation 40 years ago. We have, I think, another important second problem with the health and immigration here, which is the prohibition or the banning and the mistreatment of our cultural and ancestral experience with health. This is also shared with indigenous people and other people, right? But the discrimination, the mistreatment, the cultural censorship and lack of respect of our wisdom and our traditions in understanding health, in self-care, in this approach of preventive care, is also something that we face daily in the health system. So basically, how the health and medicine system works here is very curative, not preventive. And there is a permanent denial of our ancestral preventive holistic medicine in harmony with nature and as an important piece of our cultures. So we also face racism in abuse and discrimination on this like different approaches, right? And the denial of our own wisdom based on years and years of experience and cultural experience. Going to what is happening today with the ICE, the Immigration and Custom Enforcement, ICE, La Migra, how we call it in Spanish, right? And medicine and health and COVID. Sorry, I forgot the. We have seen in recent years the strengthening of a narrative of hatred against immigrants and our Black brothers and sisters too, right? But particularly talking about immigrants. This narrative is enforced and enacted by state policies, federal, state, and also at the local level, translating white supremacy positions, racism, and hatred, particularly against immigrants, into actions that destroy thousands of lives every day. We have seen how immigrants continue to be imprisoned just because of their immigration status. They are not criminals, or the only crime is crossing the border looking for better life opportunities for our families and loved ones. So the role of ICE and other anti-immigration institutions is to maintain an environment of fear in which immigrants cannot we cannot raise our voices in the face of the injustice that we are experiencing in different dimensions of our daily life. ICE arrests people without pending charges and makes collateral arrest, most of the time with no crime involved. We have seen even children in prison, right? Detention centers are crowded, and the prison population had been one of the most vulnerable and exposed to COVID. And at the same time, the ones that have received no social help or health care or assistance. In general, federal prisons, and ICE is a federal system, 20% of the prisoners had tested positive for COVID-19, and 1 in 847 had died of COVID. So the COVID-19 has been one of the greatest challenges for our community in the last years. We know that these health crises have been also impacted all kind of communities of color, right? So let me go here. I stole this from a school that I am going to. I want to call it is PEP, Popular Education Project, and I thought this was very clear on how race and ethnicity, relate to COVID-19. So this crisis has been exacerbated in the face of state negligence, which has deepened the crisis for the country's poor communities and has left the undocumented community to die without insurance and proper medical care and attention. But in addition to not creating a virus contingency plan for immigrant communities, the state itself has classified immigrant labor as essential work, right? Meaning that undocumented workers have been on the front lines of the pandemic, exposing ourselves, our communities, and our loved ones to the virus. This employment situation has left the immigrant community even more vulnerable to possible infection, again, deepening the crisis. So during all this year, we have been putting the food in the table, right? Now with these storms, people is shoveling the snow, cleaning the streets, right? So very different jobs that are performed by immigrant community. Furthermore, just because the economic capacity of the country has been diminished due to the economic crisis, does not mean that the functions of the state have been proportionally diminished. This is reflected in the number of deportations under the pandemic and in the number of cases of infections within detention centers. In just 4 months in 2020, more than 230 deportation flights departed from the US. This is flights that carried people who were being deported, right? And with many of these immigrants testing positive for the virus due to this process. In December, ICE sources, ICE public information maintains that there have been 185,000 deportations the fiscal year of 2020. Although this has been the lowest number of the Trump administration, it reveals the reality of the separation of families, even under the pandemic, where so many people are still dying or in this health crisis. In detention centers, the situation is even worse. In August, it's not very updated, but in August, ICE reported that there were almost 4,000 cases in detention centers. And this was before the famous second wave that has seen cases explode across the country and all over the world. So in August, according to the same report, about 20% of the immigrants who were detained had tested positive for the virus. If we update the numbers after the second wave or including the second wave, we know that's even worse. This has not been very different in the first months of Biden's presidency. The tensions, deportations are still going on as usual. The promise of the 100, the first 100 days with no deportations was canceled because of some Texas politicians. There is no social aid nor access to healthcare yet. We are still facing a public health crisis and an economic crisis that has been in development for many years, but is still keeping this way, even if we are called the essential workers. There was a discussion about the new package of COVID-19 support, and the support for undocumented immigrant community was denied, including some Democrat politicians who voted against it. I'm from Michigan, so I remember Peters and Steinbow denying the support for undocumented immigrants. Another thing that we are facing right now is the vaccine, right? So we all know that the vaccine is very important for not at the individual level, but also the herd effect. But our people, our immigrant community is very afraid to get the vaccine and ask for help. There is no access, but also if there is some access, a lot of time we also, what we do is self-margination, right? Because we are afraid to get into the formal system and to be somehow trapped and ending up in ICE, detained, deported, separated from our families, etc. Treated like criminals, basically, and separated from our families. So this is what we are facing now. What we are doing as Movimiento Cosecha, maybe I took too long, but a couple of things. We are trying to basically for the vaccine thing, not advocating for one or another option, it's a personal option, but just trying to inform and accompany on this process of at least try to face and fight the fear, to decide for those who wants the vaccine to go to get it with some community support. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. Wow. Before we go to Naira, real quick, I know you're going to leave, Azadeh, and I know one of the students wanted to ask you a question before you leave. And so I'm going to read the question. Is there anything we can do in order to provide more attention towards the ICE situation? I know there's a group on campus, BAM, by any means necessary, that usually protests outside the prisons and during hearings. Is there any way we can be a part of the voices speaking out against the harm against illegal immigrants, specifically women? So can you answer that real quick before you?
Sure. So just a note regarding terminology. So no human being is illegal. So, we refer to folks without a status and without papers as undocumented immigrants. And I also wanted to note that I put some resources in the chat in terms of some writings related to the issue of forced migration, because I think anytime we're having a discussion about immigrants' rights and why people were forced to leave their homes, we need to be talking about the roots of forced migration, which very much includes U.S. war making and destabilization and support for coups in different parts of the global South. So please take a look at the readings, and happy to stay in touch about that. In terms of what folks can do to support, one important thing you all can do is please do not be complacent. It's very important for all of us to remember. It's a different administration. There have been some policy changes, for example, a repeal to the Muslim ban, but a lot of policies still very much remain in place. Detention centers are still open. The Irving County Detention Center that I talked about is still open. People are dying in detention centers. We have had 2 people die under Biden in detention centers, including at a detention center in Georgia. So just, please be aware and make others aware in your circles about what is happening and the need for continued action and speaking up. I would highly encourage people to put pressure on Congress, on your member of Congress, especially the Democratic members of Congress, because I think there's a tendency on the part of Democrats, probably in particular, to want to stay quiet now that we have a Democratic a Democrat in office as president, and that's very disturbing. We're talking about human rights violations. It doesn't matter if the guy in charge is Republican or Democrat. These are human rights violations. Nonetheless, we need to speak out about them. Private prison corporations, very problematic. There was a question that was asked about that. So just before the pandemic, about 82% of immigrants were held in facilities operated by private prison corporations. I'm happy to share a couple more resources about the role of these private prison corporations, but there is an opportunity to make some progress on that. Some of y'all may have seen that a couple of weeks ago, Biden issued a directive to the Department of Justice to stop dealing with private prison corporations for facilities operated by Bureau of Prisons and perhaps other institutions under the purview of the Department of Justice. But that does not apply to the ICE facilities that we have been talking about, because those are under the purview of the Department of Homeland Security. So the question is why? Why was the directive not applied to ICE prisons? My hunch is that because private prison corporations have a very powerful lobby, they are making money as we speak off of the pain of immigrants. There's a forced labor program, for example, at the Stewart Detention Center, where immigrants are paid between $1 to $4 a day and sometimes nothing at all for doing the work that the private prison corporation would have had to hire regularly waged employees to do. And it's just very interesting, just very briefly, I know we don't have much time, but these private prison corporations go to poor counties in Georgia. For example, Stewart County and Irving County are 2 of the poorest in Georgia, with the promise of jobs, right? If you bring this prison to the community, there is going to be all these jobs, which is obviously a myth. And we know that people employed by those private prison corporations are not taken care of. There's a high turnover rate because they're not even provided protection for COVID, right? Let alone satisfactory job situation. But aside from that, as I mentioned, the private prison corporation relies on the forced labor of detained immigrants to keep the facility running. And people are mistreated, people are not receiving the equipment that they need, and if they refuse to participate, they are actually placed in solitary confinement. So we have a class action right now against the forced labor program at the Stewart Detention Center, and one of our clients, Shoaib Ahmed, he had not been paid. He had been working for several days, hadn't been paid, so he said no work tomorrow. And for that, he was placed in solitary confinement for several days. He has since been deported. He's still dealing with the emotional damage that he suffered while he was detained at Stewart. And all of this obviously is exploitation of immigrant labor that is benefiting the private prison corporations, that is enriching the private prison corporations. And so I think we need to be very intentional about connecting the dots between Paula talked to us about capitalism, about the capitalism, exploitation of immigrant labor, as well as U.S. militarism, and who is benefiting from these systems of exploitation, war making, and abuse. And so I'm going to put a couple more articles in the chat, as well as share our social media information, because I do need to leave in about 10 minutes. But I do look forward to staying in touch with you all, and thank you again for the opportunity to share this forum with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Naira, can you enlighten us what's going on in Flint and with yourself and the organization?
Yeah. Once again, thank you, Carolyn, for inviting me to be on this panel. Like, this is an awesome panel. So, like I have like a lot of different types of life experiences. And one of the things, like when I worked in public health, one of the things that I would talk to students about is asking them, like, what's the most important number attached to your name? And, some people said, my social security number, or they may say like my birthday is the most important. But in reality, the most important thing attached to your name is your zip code, because that is going to determine your health outcomes, like how long you're going to live, what your educational environment is going to be, what sort of toxins you may be exposed to if you live near a manufacturing facility or a refinery. And in Michigan, your zip code determined, under the emergency manager law, whether or not you were going to have access to democracy. Because the Flint water crisis, which is a prime example of state-sanctioned violence, wouldn't have happened if we did not have the heinous, undemocratic, and proto-fascist emergency manager law. Like, it just wouldn't have happened. And the goal of the emergency manager law, which, if I am retreading on previous speakers, I apologize, but I always feel when I speak to talking about the Flint water crisis that you have to have a deep understanding of what that law is and what it did. So the emergency manager law, one person who was appointed by the governor could come into your municipality, your city, your county. Well, it didn't happen. I mean, the law, like, it could have happened in a county, or your school district. And they came in and they took over 2 branches of your local government. So for a city, that's your city council and your mayor. And for a school district, that is the board of education and your superintendent. So the legislative and executive branches of your local government. And when they came in, they automatically zeroed out the salaries and responsibilities of those 2 branches of local government. And the emergency manager made the decision of what sort of job responsibilities and or salary those bodies would have moving forward. So it definitely shifted the power dynamics of your community. So instead of having a body that was elected by the people and was accountable to the people who elected them, they basically became employees of the emergency manager. So the emergency manager could hire and fire employees at whatever level they could hire employees at whatever level they wanted, outside of any sort of civil service or salary caps that a municipality would have. They could renegotiate contracts. They could sell off public assets. So they could sell off a school building. They could sell off They could sell off a park. They could sell off a school. They could sell off a stadium. And then they could enter into bankruptcy procedures. So they can file for bankruptcy on behalf of the city or school district. And at the end of the day, the role of the emergency manager was to take public resources and shift them into private hands. So it was to privatize, the public resources of communities. And one of the reasons why I say you can't talk about the Flint water crisis, because you had this assumption of what the conventional wisdom was of communities, where you would, if you had a grievance, you would go to your elected officials and they would respond to your grievance. And one of the things I also always talk about is how this is, I would say, an experimental form of voter suppression. So like we normally think of voter suppression of, like, you may see like old timey pictures of people with guns standing outside of, well, actually that happened this past election. You may see folks standing outside of your polling location with guns to intimidate you from going to vote. Or you hear stories of, like what happened in Georgia and Ohio, like luckily we haven't had that happen in Michigan, of people being purged off the voting rolls. But what the emergency manager does is you are able to elect folks, but they have no power. So you're able to elect the city council. So on its face, you still have access to democracy, but they have no power. So this is like you have communities which, like in the implementation, when majority Black and Brown communities, they were temporary residents of Michigan because they didn't have like the full access of citizenship in Michigan, So like at its height, 51% of the African American population lived in a community or school district that was under the emergency manager law. And then 75% of the Black local elected officials had their power stolen from them under the emergency manager law. And with the Flint water crisis, it really happened because of a scheme for privatization. Like that's what happened, because there was this process where they wanted to build a new water treatment plant, and Flint was Detroit's largest customer. So Flint, was the master customer, and Genesee County has a population of about 500,000 people. And we were the city of Detroit's largest customer. So moving off of that system, it created a precarious system with Detroit. So they had a cash flow problem. And actually the Detroit application for bankruptcy actually mentioned the fact as justification that Flint was off of the Detroit water system, and that paved the way for the Detroit bankruptcy. And there were nefarious actors who needed to have the customer base of Flint so they could get so they can get municipal bonds, so they can finance this new system. And one of the other things is like the emergency manager could do everything that they wanted to do. They could sell off everything, but they had to pay the bondholders. So they had to pay the municipal bonds and loans on time and in full. So Wall Street definitely profited under the emergency manager law. Like they did not miss a beat, even though the quality of life of residents in these communities around the state, like took a nosedive. Like as Flint had to eventually deal with like fucked up water, because what happened in Flint, like lead was the last thing that we were thinking about in Flint, because before we were talking about the extremely high water rates, because Flint residents were paying the highest rates in the country for combined water and sewer. Our water bills were running on average $200 to $300 a month. And And that's just like for a family or two or three. There are folks who, had water bills $600-700. And because of, the high water bills, like the lack of water could also create it like a whole systematic thing. So like lack of water, the state can come in with child protective services and remove your children from your home. They could put water liens in your home. You can lose your home through the tax foreclosure process. And as folks were having issues with the water, because the brown water, folks are going down to city council, like they couldn't do anything. Folks started having health issues. They were going to their physicians. Their physicians weren't doing anything. And then once there was chatter that it may be the water, like the physicians were too scared to even, like assign health issues to water and saying that was the source. Like we had like who knows how many people that we've had in Flint that died of Legionnaire's disease, which is a waterborne illness. And the reason why we don't know is because nobody tested for it. Like there was very few folks that may have gotten tested, and when you die, if the coroner doesn't order a test, nobody knows. We had tons of women who had miscarriages because of the water. We don't know how many people had miscarriages because that data isn't tracked at all. So like when it was time for, like I would say kind of a community health response, there was like no resources. Like all we had to rely on was anecdotal stories. If we could find folks, like we could just, like I was just finding folks on Facebook. And one of the other parallels I would say between this, the Flint water crisis, which was a pandemic, of lack of water and just the state sanctioned violence, and the COVID-19 pandemic is like the response is basically a disaster capitalism playbook. Because what happened in Flint, like once we were finally, like we had to push the state, we had to gather our own research because community anecdotal validators were not respected by state officials. And once we got folks with alphabet letters after their name to reaffirm what the community folks were saying, they were still dismissed. And we had an ally who was a physician that looked at data that's required to be collected by the federal government. So if you are a mother and you're on public assistance and have a child, the child has to have their blood level tested, because the conventional wisdom is that these families are living in older stock homes with lead-based paint. Because before the Flint water crisis, the conventional wisdom for sources of lead exposure is paint and soil and dust. It was not water before the Flint water crisis. And when you talk to any public health professional, any physician, and in 2015, they would say, "You're out your ever-loving mind." That is not it at all. But once we started to get like the response, the state was still using this as an opportunity to abuse residents. ICE was using it as an opportunity to abuse residents. We had ICE conducting raids outside of grocery stores as people were going to purchase water. We had our county sheriff taking folks on work release to deliver water, and they were drinking unfiltered water in the county jail. And Flint Rising actually began with a canvas to the undocumented Spanish-speaking community because they did not know it was a crisis. They found out it was a crisis when it became international news, and it was like on Telemundo and Univision everywhere else, and their families are calling from their countries of origin telling them to not drink the water. And there was no information in any language other than English. Like, we had to find folks to translate state materials into Spanish for us to go door to door to tell people to not drink the water and not boil the water. And like looking at like these gaps of what happens when disaster strikes is chilling. And unfortunately, no one has learned their lesson from what happened to Flint. Like what's happening during COVID-19 is tantamount to that, because how is it that you have a community shutting off people's water when one of the only ways to prevent the spread is to wash your hands? Because you have folks, because of the high water bills, that have not had water in their homes. Like, they're conserving water because they have to purchase water, and they're trying to pay down, like their water bill. And so that, on top of like toxic communities, which is also Black and brown communities, because you're exposed to all of these toxins, like you also have like these underlying health conditions. And like as Flint Rising, like our whole community is immunocompromised because of asthma, because of diabetes, because of like other respiratory illnesses that now people have to deal with, because of the chemicals that they were exposed to during the water crisis. Because what was happening was our water was untreated for 18 months, and we were just drinking whatever was coming out of that tap. And because lead is colorless and tasteless, like the only thing, like if discolored water is rust, and we had like like it may smell like chlorine because it was a chlorine byproduct. That the chemical that if you're taking a hot shower and inhaling it is 6 times more deadly than if you actually drink it. So you have folks now that now have like chronic health conditions like asthma or something that looks like COPD, and you're just or in allergies and all these other things, that there's still issues with folks that don't have that their anecdotal experiences and what they know, what their gut feeling of what's happening to them is not matching up to what professional medicine is saying. And right now, that is, like, I would say, even more important and even more critical right now, because we are in the middle of settling this class action lawsuit. And part of that for adults is you have to have documentation of how you were harmed. Now, if someone even had access to a doctor during that time, those physicians were not attributing whatever health issues they had to exposure to Flint drinking water. There are folks now that have like rashes. I know someone that's had like what looks like a rash for like 5 years now. And when you have like the state chief medical officer just telling them that they just need to take some Benadryl so they can go to sleep, it's just totally insulting. It's totally insulting. And I would say, like, it kind of reaffirms, like as someone who identifies as African American and has read books like Medical Apartheid, it reaffirms, like a lot of distrust of how Black people like interface with the medical system, the healthcare system, because like, how would you like to, like, your experience is going to contribute to like your experience, like future experiences. So there's this federally qualified health center in Flint that has armed security. Now, how often are you going to be going to a place that has armed security, and then when you go in, they talking to you any old kind of way. And then when you go back to see a doctor, it's an extern because you're not going to have a private physician. So you're going to be cycling through someone every time you go there. Like, you're not going to want to go back. Like, who wants to go into any situation knowing they're going to be abused? I don't, unless you're a masochist. Like, maybe then you probably like abuse, but like, you get happy with it. But that's something that, like, I don't want. And finally, I just want to talk about, like, because of these things, like near the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, me and a few other folks in Flint, like, we really worked to, get a resolution passed in June, declaring racism as a public health crisis. So we got our county board of health, which manages our health department and our city of Flint, and then like Genesee County Board of Commissioners, which is our county regulatory body, because like we knew that we were in the middle of, Flint is in the middle of a systemic, which is multiple pandemics. We're an ongoing Flint water crisis, ongoing the fallout from the emergency manager law, the COVID-19 pandemic, structural divestment, poverty. There were all these things that were happening, and we needed to really create a framework and scaffold, like addressing some of these root causes, because like we really need to make sure that our policies like actually center people and not corporations, because our policies right now, enriches capitalism. Because it wouldn't, like, why is it so easy for a community that is supposed to be in debt, like getting hooked up to more debt, versus like reinvesting in communities and ensuring that folks, have a good quality of life, and knowing that like somebody's zip code shouldn't be a barrier to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Naira. Wow. We're gonna move into the questions. We have a couple questions from the chat, and then I don't know if some of the students want to ask directly, but I'll start with one of the questions that was for Paula. What is the symbolism behind the name cosecha, the momento cosecha?
It's an eagle, but it's an eagle that remembers the National Farm Workers Association in the 60s, which was a very important organization of farm immigrant workers. I don't know if you hear about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. There were two of kind of leaders of that movement. So that National Farm Workers Association had a flag with an eagle. And the eagle at that time, that one, the original, was black because it was to represent like the situation of the immigrant people, but it's also related to a Mexican eagle from the Aztecas, so it has also like an indigenous root. And now we kind of take it like, history.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question for you, Naira. Can you share the story of how there was a GM plant in Flint who stopped using the new water source because it was corroding their machinery about 18 months before the public knew about the lead crisis? Corporate health before public health.
Oh, most definitely. So, so the switch happened April 25th, 2014. And immediately after the switch, like people had discolored water, like it would smell like rotten eggs. I know like mine was like looking like straight Hennessy, didn't taste like Hennessy, didn't smell like open sewer. And so folks were going down, going down to city council and like, trying to address the grievance of the water, and just knowing that, like when we were on Detroit water, like this wasn't happening. And once we switched to Flint River water, like we're getting all these issues. And the first thing that happened was we had a bunch of boil water advisories because it was E. coli contamination. And so we had folks dealing with that on top of like people who were getting shut off due to the inability to pay. And the emergency manager was also prosecuting folks who were turning water on their own. And I mentioned, earlier, like why people would turn on their own water. But in October of 2014, there was an article saying that General Motors, like their parts are being rusted at a plant here in Flint, at assembly plant here in Flint. And the city of Flint, and General Motors is the city of Flint's largest single water customer. The city of Flint was like, hey, well, the emergency manager, Darnell Early, was like, hey, what we're gonna do is you don't have to pay us any water. You can get hooked up to Genesee County, which there's the city of Flint, and the city of Flint made the decision to draw off the Flint River water. Everywhere else that had municipal water in the county was still on the Detroit water, Detroit Port Huron water. And so the emergency manager under the city of Flint said that, like you don't have to pay us any money for water until like we built this new pipeline, and we're gonna even pay for the hookup for you to get to Detroit water. Like you don't have to pay for General Motors, a multi-billion-dollar corporation. A community that's supposed to be $15 million in debt is going to pay for it. And immediately after, like we were talking about like why can General Motors get access to clean water that isn't messing up, is not discolored, and why we didn't have it, like what's happened to our bodies, like that's what we were asking. And the emergency manager said that was apples and oranges, that was absolutely apples and oranges, and it was just crazy.
Thank you. I have a question in the chat for both of you. It says, I'm wondering about how you make decisions within the organizations you work with. For example, does everyone working on the project have to agree before you take an action? I don't know which one of you want to go first.
I'm laughing a little bit because one of the things that I'm very proud of is that Movimiento Cosecha has been going under a process of developing and trying to strengthening our internal democracy. So Movimiento Cosecha started like 5 years ago, and it started with some people who had been involved in the DACA movement, the DACA, the Dreamers, the kids who came to the US when they were kids, and then under Obama, they got this permission, the DACA status, which is basically, it's not citizenship, it's just a permission to work and study, right? So some people came from there, and they started the movement, but over the past year, we have been in a process for trying to really try to mirror the society we want to build, right? And the relationships we want to build on. So it's not just like in the future, right? We can start to do that in our own communities. And of course, the experiences and the tools and everything is very different in any group, right? And this is a movement. We are in 7 states now, but we organize in circles. So there is a circle in any city that we are in. So Detroit Circle, Ann Arbor Ipsy Circle, I don't know, and different other cities, right? So for making decisions on the actions at the national level, we all have to agree. So we have a strategic planning that was discussed with all the circles, and all the circles in the cities come together to a state level assembly, and the state level assembly come together to an open assembly, a national assembly. So we had, not for every action, because we had local actions, right? But the circle should agree. Also, we have a principle called the principle of the three. So when three people has an idea, they also can propose it and go ahead, but with a minimum with three people at the local level. So it depends. For example, if we have a national campaign, what we had for the inauguration day. For the inauguration day, we want to make sure that Biden hears us, that we have this motto, which is actions, not promises, right? So we want to be sure that they understand that we are still in the fight and we are still fighting and moving forward. So we had a national campaign. We dropped banners in more than 30 cities. And that was decided for the National Assembly. But also we have local campaigns, right? So it depends of the level. But yes, basically the membership, we are all members. There is no like hierarchy and no, we don't use kind of the traditional, you know, like, I don't know, boards or directors or stuff like that. We are a movement, so we are all members. So basically we coordinate in different instances. I try to explain it. I don't know.
No, that's good. Thank you. Thank you. Nair?
Yes, I actually love talking about this because I remember like when I first was chosen to be the director. I'm a founding director of Flint Rising. I was like, yo, like I want to have a non-hierarchical cooperative decision-making model organization. And folks were like, you must be crazy. Like we're kind of curious, but kind of good luck with that. So I would say like through the 5 years, because Flint Rising started in February 2016, you know, like we're able to kind of really build out practices of like the staff makes the decision and like the members make the decision as well. So like if there's like an action, you know, like what happens is like I either pitch it to everyone or like somebody else pitches it to everyone, and that's how it goes. But then the other thing, which was interesting, is you know, like dealing with, I would say, kind of like this environment of the nonprofit industrial complex is like how we can like, because like director is just like a title, you know, but we look at stuff for like what people's roles and responsibilities are, and like how can we support if folks want to learn different responsibilities. So like we have, you know, like so for example, like fundraising, like I do fundraising, and then like we have like 2 other staff members that also can do fundraising and also has done fundraising. Like I do like most of the writing, but we've like really had like deep conversations to figure out what folks' strengths are and what role they want to play to kind of build this movement for justice and reparations for Flint residents.
Thank you for that. Before I pass it over to Craig, I want to see if any other students had questions that they might want to ask. And if not, I can pass it to Craig. And I want to thank both of you and Azadeh for joining us. And this was very informative panel. And just I encourage us and others. Well, I have a question. How can folks get involved with, I know we talked with Azadeh about what's going on there, but how can folks get involved with what's going on with you all and stay in touch with you all?
In our case, we are like I said before, an organization led by immigrants, but also we work with allies, and the allies are active part of our movement. So we have core circles with immigrants and ally circles. And we work together. Sometimes we meet together every week or every other week, and also separated. So I'm gonna post here. I think that in our case, the fastest way, you can check out the website, but we are having some problems with the people updating the website. So we are more active in Facebook. So I'm gonna post the Facebook page there. And we have a national Facebook page, but also for every state. So if we are in Michigan, I'm gonna post the Michigan too.
Thanks, Naira.
Yeah, so like we have a Facebook page, Flint Rising. But I right now, like it hasn't really been all that active. Just because like I had to take some time off of work. So I'm just trying to get back into it. But I guess like what's happening right now, which I guess happening with a bunch of environmental justice organizations and climate justice organizations, is you know, like there's gonna be ramping up like in the late spring, maybe. I don't know months, and I don't know like what that means for our seasons, but like April, May, June, the next, like at least like far as like Congress, the next budget reconciliation process, like after the COVID-19 funding goes out the door, the next one is going to be around climate and infrastructure. And so like we're really pushing for like actual investment in our infrastructure, including like rebuilding like water mains and that sort of thing. And I would say like at the state level, like the end of March, right now, the moratorium on water shutoffs and mandatory reconnections is being sunsetted because of like the other issues that happened last year with Governor Whitmer's executive powers. So like we're going to be having like a bunch of different conversations to try to get that extended. And also like we're going to be participating along with other organizations for World Water Day, which is March 22nd. So you'll probably see stuff. I'm not sure like how that's gonna go, like maybe People's Water Board or so like, but you know, like we also like one of the things that we found you know helpful is like nobody can do it by themselves. Like can't be one organization being like the be all to end all. So we always work in collaboration and in solidarity and in collaboration with other organizations like around the state and around the country.
Thank you for that. I think Craig has a question, but I want to encourage the students to follow both of these, all of these organizations on social media. And if you want to get in contact with them, you know, please do so. I encourage folks on the students and folks listening on YouTube. Craig, you had a question?
Yes, thank you so much. Naira, I had a question I wanted to ask you. Considering the long history of racism in medicine that Carolyn had some opening remarks regarding, as well as the recent experience with the Flint water crisis, what is your sense of how they both relate to folks' willingness to get the COVID vaccine or resistance around the vaccine? I'm wondering just what you're seeing, hearing throughout Flint and your work around people's general trust or distrust of the vaccine as it comes out. I know that's a hot question and an important one in everybody's mind, so I'm just wondering what you're hearing.
I mean, right now, because it's like a supply chain problem, like people don't have access to the vaccine, even if they wanted to get a vaccine. like right now in Genesee County, like we have like almost 40,000 people who have signed up, and that's increasing about 2,000 per day. And there are about 2,500 vaccines that are being administered a day. So like for that to be right-sided is it's going to take like a long time, unless folks actually if once vaccines like actually come down the pipe and actually be in communities. I know, like for me personally, like I'm immunosuppressed. I have asthma, like I have seizures, and I had I have autoimmune disease too. So I was a little bit concerned because I was just afraid of the like I want to eventually get vaccinated, but just because like like when you see stuff happen too fast, you're just like you're a little bit hesitant. Like I'm gonna wait for them to work out all the kinks before I kind of like step into that. But what's happening actually like in Flint right now is basically two things. One, making sure that vaccines are actually going to Black and brown people, but a lot of that is like mandated by the state. So it's like there's all these competing interests. Like we want to make sure that the people who are most impacted and who have been dying left and right, are getting the vaccines first. But like what happens when you have disaster capitalism is like it automatically leans towards inequality. And so like what we have been seeing is I want to say, like because they haven't been like at the state levels, at the state level they're not tracking ethnicity like other states are tracking an ethnicity. And so like we're in conversations with the state, like why aren't you tracking ethnicity? Like how can we ensure that folks, how can we create mechanisms for interrupting the status quo system so we can have Black and brown people be vaccinated with like no barriers, because like we have like one vaccination site. Like I was there one day, and we only have drive-up vaccination sites in Genesee County. Like we don't have like any walk-up ones. So that's also kind of like an impediment. But when I was there, I saw 3 out of one day, which was 500 vaccines. I saw 3 Black people. And it was supposed to be and it's like in a majority Black neighborhood, but like 3 Black people for that whole thing. So, I mean, it's gonna be tough because like with other things, there are other things that happen. So there's gonna have to be like a lot of for folks to actually be vaccinated. There's gonna have to be a lot of things that's gonna happen, like having things in the evening, and not during like the 9 to 5 sort of thing, like having stuff on weekends. So folks who have to work and not like me, which I like I work from home and I create my own schedule. Everybody don't live like that. Like people gotta leave the house to go to work. So it's just gonna be a lot.
Thank you. Oh, you're gonna go, Craig?
Did you want to say anything else, Karen?
I just want to make sure the speakers stay on after we end the stream because it's a little delayed, and I want to thank them again, and I want to thank the students and folks on social media. And if you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe to the General Baker Institute YouTube page. And thanks again.
And I just wanted to say a couple quick things also. Thank you, Nayura, Paola, and our earlier speaker for being here. This was a great night. We're going to meet again in 2 weeks. And so I just wanted to kind of point everybody's attention to our next class. So we don't meet next week, students and folks watching on YouTube. We take a break next Wednesday, but then we return March 3rd. And David Goldberg, historian who teaches at Wayne State University in African American Studies, and also a member of the General Baker Institute, will be moderating. And the theme for that session is policing public health, cops, robber barons, and protest. And so we're going to take a close look at policing in the larger context of policing as a public health crisis, you could say, is one way to think about it. And so thank you again to all the speakers, for everybody for being here. This was a really important conversation, and there were so many great resources shared by everybody in the chat and in your presentation. So I really appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was one of my former students waving at the last second there, who I haven't seen in 2 years. That was great. Thank you so much, Paula and Nayera. That was really, really important.